Lola, it was late. Lola sat with her two daughters and her husband in the living room. Her daughters were Amarachi and Chizzy. Amarachi was the older sister at 22 and Chizzy was only 19. Their family was breaking up. Lola and her husband Namdi were going through a very difficult time in their marriage. They had been married for many years. The two girls loved their parents and fought very hard to save their marriage. Lola knew, however, that she was the cause of the problem. She was too distant from her husband, unable to connect. Namdi had endured this for many years, but he didn't have it in him to tolerate it any longer. He didn't want the divorce, but he was also tired of trying. Today, Lola finally decided to open up. She was finally ready to tell her story. She kept taking deep breaths and long pauses. They could tell that it took a lot out of her to be able to finally speak up about her past. She turned to her girls. "I'm sorry for everything that's happening between me and your father. Please don't blame him." She looked at Nnamdi, who didn't make any eye contact with her. "He has done the best he can over these many years to love and take care of me." She took another deep breath. "I need to tell you something. It might be very hard for you to hear this, but I believe that you are both old enough and I'm finally ready to tell you." Lola avoided eye contact as much as possible. Instead, she looked away as she began to unravel the story behind her past. This is Lola's story. My father was an engineer and my mother wasn't working. She was a full-time housewife and mother. We lived in Lekki for a while and from time to time we would have to travel to other states for my father to work. He was very good at his job and people used to give him contracts in different states. One day my father was to travel to Kogi State for a few days and we were all supposed to join him, but he decided to go alone because he didn't want it to affect our school. A few days after he left, we heard that he had an accident on his way and was in critical condition. We prayed, we hoped, but some days after that he passed away. He didn't make it. I was 10 years old at the time. I was the oldest child and I had 5 other siblings. Everything changed once my father passed away. My mother was not the same anymore. Life became very, very hard, very difficult. The money my father had left us could only get us through a couple of months. We struggled so much. It became hard to eat, hard to go to school. After some time, I noticed that my mother would put me in charge of the house and she would just go out for long hours, returning very late at night. She would just come back home and I would hear her crying in her room. But somehow, the next day we would have enough food and money for school. For several months, mommy would go out, come back, cry, and the next day we had enough to eat, money to keep up with rent and the NEPA bills and everything. After a while, she wasn't crying anymore. She wasn't laughing anymore. It was as if she just became a cold, numb person. It was later when I got older that I knew that my mom was prostituting, sleeping with men for money just so that we could survive. She didn't cry anymore because she had accepted it. She walked around as someone who had no soul anymore. She had given herself up to her fate. My mother grew up from a poor family, so they couldn't help. My father's family did not like her, so they refused to help. We were on our own and she had to do something to take care of her 6 children. I knew she loved us, but the situation of life just buried her heart in pain. 2 years after my father's death, my mother came home smiling. It had been a long time since I saw her smiling like that. So I asked her, This one that you're smiling like this, what happened? You see, I had to grow up very, very fast. I had to spend time taking care of my younger siblings and being there for them. She flashed a ring in my face. I'm getting married though, she said. I still remember the embedded smile in her face when she said that. It came as a complete shock to me. I had never seen her in the house with any man. She had not introduced us to anybody. Nonetheless, I was happy because it meant that she would no longer leave us to do the things she was doing. Most of all, someone would be there to provide for us again like our father did. I hugged her and all I could say was, "Thank God, Mommy. Thank God." A few weeks later, my mom came to the house with a man. She had already married him in a very quiet court wedding. We didn't even know when it happened. He was a very tall man. He had no hair on his head and a small scar on his forehead. When he came into the house with my mother, he seemed a bit quiet as she introduced him. We all huddled around him to give him a hug and welcome him into the family as my mother instructed. I felt relieved that he was here. Although I didn't know him very well or had not met him previously, I was so sure that our problems would be over. It was hard to think that my father would be replaced by someone else, but at least we would not starve and I could return to being a normal child again. Shortly after he started living with us, I saw that nothing had really changed with my mother. She would still go out and return late at night and spend little time with us. On the other hand, Larry, her new husband, spent most of his time at home. He never went to work and barely left the house. One day, I was in the kitchen trying to see what I could cook for us at home. As I turned around, I was startled to find Larry just standing in the doorway staring at me. He didn't say anything, but he just stared. After some time, he left. I didn't understand it then, but in the coming weeks, I learned why the hard way. Another day, while I washed clothes in the backyard, then Larry was staring at me. This had happened many times before, but usually he would just stare at me and leave. This time was different. This time he walked up to me, and I knew as he walked that he meant no good. He grabbed me so tightly and he said, "I can't resist you anymore." He said that I had been trying to seduce him, and he had been resisting, but that now he would give me what I wanted. Right there, he tore my clothes, pushed aside the bucket I was washing clothes in, on the concrete floor, in the hot sun. He raped me. After he did what he did, he went inside for a few minutes and then came back and carried me inside. I was barely conscious. He put me in their bedroom, cleaned me up because I was bleeding, wore me new clothes and gave me some painkillers. I felt terribly ill for many days after that. I couldn't tell anyone, not even my siblings, not my mother. She was barely home. 2 weeks after that incident, it happened again and again and again until I just stopped fighting it. Whenever he would finish, he would say, "I love you." Till today, I can't tell anyone I love you. And I struggle when someone says that to me because to me, I love you means hurt and pain and shame and worthlessness. After a few months, my mother decided to start staying at home more. One of her close friends and colleagues had contracted HIV and passed away. This ordeal made my mom think about her life again, and so she decided to quit prostituting and try to get her life back together. So finally, I decided to tell my mother about everything that was happening and how Larry was raping me. I approached her one day while she sat in the living room. I told her everything. Everything. She just looked at me and put her head down. She cried and held me in her arms. She just kept saying how sorry she was and how she wished she could change things. That night, she decided to confront him. I was in the room and I could overhear them talking. My mother had asked Larry to leave and he kept begging her, pleading with her. Eventually, she forgave him and she allowed him to stay. I was completely mortified. How could she allow him to remain in the house? It made no sense at all. How could she allow that monster, that beast, to stay in the house with us? The rape continued. My mother turned a blind eye. She was fully aware and she did nothing to protect me, nothing to save me. She needed Larry to warm her bed, to be her companion, and I was the sacrifice she was willing to pay. She would try to appease me by giving me gifts, big portion sizes at mealtime. I became a different person. I was broken. I had no soul. I was a shadow, a frame. I began to desire death. I invited it. I longed for it because I felt like a junkyard. Years passed and it was time for me to go to university. I gained admission into the University of Ibadan. I was happy about it. It would be an escape from my hell. I would have to live in the hostel away from home, away from that darkness and filth. When I moved into the hostel, it wasn't long before I realized that I had not really escaped. Though physically I wasn't being raped anymore, still my mind, my heart was polluted. I couldn't get rid of the filth I felt all around me. No matter how much I tried, it was like a stain that I could never ever wash off. It wasn't long. Being a fresher, many guys started hitting on me, asking me out. I was so easy. Any guy who came my way didn't have to try too hard. He would have his way with me. I slept with so many guys I lost count. I didn't love them. I didn't even want them, but it was this stain. It spoke to me and told me that this was what I was on earth for. To be used. This was my purpose, to be used. One of the guys eventually introduced me to pornography. And that was it. I became addicted to pornography and masturbation. When I wasn't sleeping with a man, that was what I was doing. I attempted suicide like 3 or 4 times. I had over 4 abortions and some STDs. I felt like garbage. Absolute garbage. I was disconnected from my family. I barely went home for the holidays, and whenever I did, it was always cold and quiet. Larry and my mother were fighting more often now. They rarely agreed on anything. Sometimes it was verbal, but other times it was even physical. I couldn't understand why they stayed together. He no longer raped me because he said I was too old now. He was a very sick man. My mother was even more sick for staying in the same house with such a person. Seeing them stay in such a toxic and painful situation made me wonder about life. Why would a person choose destruction? Why would a person willingly choose to inject poison in their own veins and watch themselves die? When I went home one day, I tried so hard to sleep, but I couldn't sleep. I opened my eyes and stared hard into the ceiling. It seemed as if I had a vision because I saw myself living but dead. All I could see in my future was a living dead person walking about. I had already tried to commit suicide, but I didn't die. I was in a hole. I knew, but if I was going to be alive, I had to get out of that hole. I had to find a way out of that hole. There was no other option. I had to be free. I didn't know how, but I had to be free. I finally went to bed, and for the first time in my life, I was hopeful. I went back to school after my short break. I kept myself in that hopeful state as much as I could. I remember that there was a counseling unit in our school, so I went there to seek help. I was afraid that if I didn't receive help, my next suicide attempt would be successful. As I walked into the office, I met a young, handsome man at the receptionist desk. Your father. He was a young copper at the time. He pointed me to the waiting area and went in to inform the counselor of my arrival. Eventually, an older lady with very kind, soothing eyes came out and invited me into her office. Her name was Mrs. Kewe. She saved my life. From the moment I walked into her office, I knew that she could help me. I knew my pain was deep, but she was the first person that really gave me a listening ear. So I poured out my pain to her, and she was very patient, giving me enough time to cry, catch my breath, and tell her everything. She knew I needed a lot of help, so she set up a schedule to meet with me 2 times a week. There were days during those sessions I could talk and other days I couldn't. Mrs. Kewe remained extremely patient with me. For several months, she became the mother I longed for, the one that got stolen from me. I looked up to her and looked forward to spending more time with her. As I worked with Mrs. Kewe, the more I came to her office, the more Nnamdi, your father, and I became fond of each other. We would often exchange jokes and conversations. We would talk for extended hours. Whenever we seemed to get closer or share any form of emotional intimacy, I would draw back. I was still emotionally unavailable. Although I made progress with Mrs. Kewe, I still needed much work. He never really knew the full extent of my story. It took a very long time, but I eventually fell for your father. He was different from every man I had met. He was the only one who never wanted to use me, the only one who showed me another possibility. I agreed to go into a relationship with him and we started seeing each other. To be honest, we didn't spend a lot of time in the relationship. Around when he finished his service, he proposed to me, and before I knew it, we got married in a small ceremony. By this time, Mrs. Kewe was no longer employed with the school and we kept in touch, but not as often as I wanted. My sessions with Mrs. Kewe were tremendous and made a strong impact in my life, but it was not enough. It didn't deal completely with the root of it all. I was still carrying this damage around me. Being married to your father has been wonderful, but you see, it takes 2 healthy people to have a healthy marriage. Your father has done the best he can. He has loved me, waited on me. He has been a precious husband. But my daughters, I know that I cannot give him the same. I don't know how to receive love. I don't know how to give it. I find it hard to separate the feeling of pain and the feeling of love. They seem like one and the same to me sometimes, and it has really, really mutilated our marriage. After Lola finished her story, the atmosphere of the room became very somber. Her daughters, Amarachi and Chizi, cried. Nnamdi just stared very blankly at his wife, holding back the tears in his own eyes. He knew she had passed through some things, but he didn't know the full details of the ordeal she went through in her younger years. Everyone was silent for a few minutes, processing in their hearts the things they had just heard. Finally, Amarachi spoke. Mommy, I'm so sorry for everything that happened to you. I can't even imagine what that could have been like. Then Chizi also spoke up. Mommy, I don't even know what to say. To think that all these years I resented you for how cold you were to Daddy sometimes. How overprotective you are of us. She put her head down. Nnamdi finally arose and sat beside his weeping wife. He took her hand in his and rubbed through her hair. My Omalicha, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what you have been through. We can walk through it. It's not too late. We can fix this. How? How can we fix it? I can't be fixed, Lola exclaimed in defeat. Nnamdi replied, I don't know, my darling. I don't know, but there must be a way to help you. Maybe more counseling and therapy. I don't know, there must be a way. Suddenly, Amarachi looked up at them. Mommy, how about Mrs. Kewe? We can try to find her. I mean, she helped you once before. Maybe she can help you again. I know it's been many years, but maybe we should try to look for her again and see if she can help us. Namdi smiled at Amarachi, approving of the idea. That's a very good idea, Amarachi. Let's find her. I know before I stopped working for her, she gave me her number, but honestly, I never kept in touch. Lola was quiet, thinking it over. She wiped away her tears, embraced her family. I would do anything to keep my family. I don't want to lose you all. Then she said in a soft voice, Yes, I agree. Let's find her. So Lola and her family began the search for Mrs. Kewe in an attempt to help her emotional state and preserve her family. Join us on our next episode for part 2 of Lola's story.